if you'll allow me just to begin by introducing Lord David Willetts to us. Now, David was educated at King Edward's School in Birmingham and then subsequently at Christ Church College in Oxford, where he studied philosophy, politics and economics and came out with a first. He became a Conservative MP in 1992 and was a Conservative MP for Havant in Hampshire through to 2015. And indeed, he was the Minister of State for Universities and Science between 2010 and 2014. As I mentioned, he was raised to the House of Lords and currently works as a visiting lecturer at King's College in London. He's also the Chancellor of Leicester University and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society. David is also the President of the Resolution Foundation, which is a living standards think tank. And interestingly, when I come on to talk about his book, one of the, this is David's book, it's a well-thumbed copy, I've read The Pinch often, and it says Willetts is a one-man think tank. So we'll come back to that in a second. Before, though, I do introduce the main topic of the conversation, I would like to just put a little plug in, because as well as writing The Pinch and several other books, David has also written an absolutely fabulous book on universities and university education. It's called A University Education. It was published in 2017, and David will be pleased to hear this, but I bought a copy of A University Education for every single member of my governing body because I thought it was such a good background read for anyone interested in higher education. So that's a little plug for that. Of course, this is a festival of ideas, and we're so pleased, David, that we have you with us because you are genuinely known for your original ideas. And indeed, I would like to suggest that The Pinch generated a certain originality in terms of the idea that effectively the baby boomers, and I have to say, I'm looking at my haircut and your haircut, and I think it's probable that we're both baby boomers, but effectively that the baby boomers had kind of messed it up for the millennial generation. But I wonder if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about The Pinch, how you got your ideas, and really just summarize what the findings and your hypothesis is about that intergenerational contract that we have.
Yeah, well, The Pinch originated both from my constituency experience and also more widely my shadow cabinet experience. In the constituency, it was young people coming to see me at my surgery, and he was working at Tesco's and she was a nurse or whatever, and they just couldn't find anywhere to live, certainly nowhere they could afford, and they were camping in the spare bedroom of his parents or her parents, despite being way beyond the age when I'd been able to buy my first flat in London. So there was the personal experience. And then separately, in my years in shadow cabinet, I spent a lot of them shadowing either education or pensions. And it made you realize that government kind of transfers resources out to young people and old people. It tends to collect taxes from middle-aged people. And what was the balance between the taxes collected from people at the middle and the support for people at each age of the life cycle? And of course, pensioners in particular had got big increases in public spending. It was tackling a genuine problem. A generation ago, pensioners were old and poor. Old and poor meant the same kind of thing. But we've actually reached the position where now being old is not a particular predictor that you'll be poor. Whereas sadly, the financial pressures are more acute for families and younger people. So that was the backdrop to it. And when I first wrote the book, people were very aware of all those other unfairnesses that worry us by class, by gender, by ethnicity. But I don't think that the generational angle had quite registered. And over the last decade, since I first wrote it, I think it's become a very hot topic.
Mm. And you've often used, I've heard you speak before on this, and you've used the kind of analogy of hunter-gatherers as a great way of sort of simply explaining this sort of contract that we have throughout our lives, depending on what age we are and how much we can contribute. Just let us hear a little bit about the hunter-gatherers. I think it's a great story.
Well, for me, it's the social contract, which political philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. What is the social contract? What holds a society together? For me, the contract between the generations is what holds a society together. Because if you imagine that we were born kind of independent with full capacity to feed ourselves and care for ourselves from the beginning, I don't think there would be society. So the argument is that, and we can track it both in the modern welfare state and in the most primitive tribes that survive in the forests of Amazonia or whatever, you see that when they're young, kids are net recipients of calories which are provided for them by the middle-aged members of the tribe. And it takes them quite a long time before they are fully capable of finding calories for themselves. In fact, because humans by and large have quite sophisticated diet, it happens in their mid to late teens. Then when they are in prime adult age, they're actually collecting and hunting more calories than they personally consume, putting money into the tribe. And then as they get older and their performance as hunters or gatherers declines, they once again become net recipients of calories from others. And so if you imagine a kind of perfect stable model, over your life, your calorie consumption roughly matches your calorie production. But the purpose of living in a tribe is to smooth it out so that you receive when you're young, you overproduce when you're middle-aged, you receive when you're old. So I think that's what holds a society together. But if you have a very big cohort, a very large generation working their way through that system, then when they're young, the middle-aged have to work extra hard because there's so many young mouths to feed. When they're all at prime age, there's lots of producers, they have a great time, there's fewer dependents on either side. And then when they're old and dependent, the people, the smaller generation behind them has to work extra hard. So I argue that being a big generation works to your advantage in that type of model.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, even in your hunter-gatherer scenario, the sort of point, the tipping point when you start becoming a beneficiary again is age 65, funnily enough, retiral age, or normally retiral age. Very interesting. Now, of course, COVID, the coronavirus pandemic, has had a major impact on our young people. We know from surveys that have been done, 26% roughly, survey by Prospect suggests that 26% of the students that they interviewed 5,000 students, 26% have lost their internships, 28% have had graduate job offers deferred. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies has identified that job postings are only 8% of what they were last year. So, you know, a real problem for people going into employment just now, and in particular, you know, from my perspective, coming from universities into employment. And what do you think their job prospects are? What do you think their life prospects are? And what might we do about it?
Well, short term, job prospects are sadly very poor indeed. It's hard to see employers recruiting lots of new people over the next few months. And that's why what I've advocated, we at Resolution Foundation have advocated, is kind of an education levers initiative. Because to be honest, for many of those young people leaving school or college or university, their job prospects are so bad that the best single thing you could do is provide them with a few extra months of education or training. It's partly just to compensate them for the disruption they've suffered over the past few months, but also to give them something more worthwhile to do than simply signing on for unemployment benefit. And what I've suggested is you could imagine a kind of competition around an innovation fund, inviting universities, colleges, local education, local economic partnerships, LEPs, to come together to say, here's a program that we could offer for education leavers locally. And I think that would really help them. If we can't do that, then I think as a minimum, what we need to do is to be more flexible on the rules for what they can do whilst they are claiming unemployment benefits. So sadly, I think many of them at the moment could end up on universal credit, getting perhaps about £95 a week. But there are some quite strict rules, which in normal times make sense, where you can't be on an education or training program for more than about a month while you're claiming those benefits. So a more sort of another version of what I'm proposing would be to liberalize the rules so it was possible to combine the receipt of that universal credit with continuing to study at your local college or university.
Yeah, and David, you know, you speak very highly of universities and university education in your other book, but of course there's a whole spread and part of society which perhaps we're even more worried about are those who don't have access to and don't get to universities. Have you any suggestions as to what they, I mean, is it further education colleges? Is it apprenticeships? What is that kind of educational package that they might be offered?
Well, of course, people say apprenticeships, but apprenticeships actually have quite a narrow and specific meaning. They're quite heavily regulated. They involve getting a proper job for an employer, a commitment by the employer to continue to release you for educational training for at least a day a week, and it may well take a year at least, if not two. And the sad fact is, as part of the problems in the jobs market now, there's actually been a big reduction in the number of apprenticeships available for young people. One figure I saw was an 80% fall in new apprenticeships. So it'd be great if there were more apprenticeships. But I think alongside that, we need something a bit more flexible and simple, what I would call traineeships. And again, that's another example of the kind of initiative we need now, which could be training for 3 to 6 months. It could be delivered by an FE college, ideally with a link to local employers providing some kind of work experience that gets you some kind of useful certificate, even if it's not a full-blown apprenticeship in the sense that you've got a local employer who's offered you a job. You should be able to access it via an FE college. And I think that would be another way of boosting opportunities for young people.
Yeah, and do you still see a university education as something which is positively beneficial for young people? I mean, is it something they should do? Does it add to their overall life earnings and presumably contributions to society and so on?
Oh, I certainly do. I think going to university for many young people, not for everyone, but for many young people, is a fantastic opportunity. And I've been very frustrated in the years since I stood down from politics and stood down as the minister, at how the media narrative has rather turned against higher education and universities. And I think it's very regrettable. And if there's a young person who thinks, you know, I'd like to go to university, but I read all this stuff, I don't think I'll bother, they'd be making a terrible mistake and missing out. So university's provides a range of valuable experiences. First of all, it is just how in advanced Western countries, for many people, we manage the transition to adulthood. It's when you first leave the family home, you're not fully independent, you've got a kind of semi-supervised environment. It is a well-recognized route to adulthood, in many ways replacing the role of conscription in earlier stages of our development. And then secondly, you do actually learn useful stuff. And many courses actually have that as a requirement for getting a job: nursing, training, teaching, engineering. And then, of course, thirdly and finally, we do know that it does prepare you for life in other ways. You're likely to be rather healthier. You're likely to, if anything, devote more time to volunteering. So university changes people and helps make them good citizens. So yeah, if you can get in and if you want to do it, you should definitely go for it.
Yeah, and within university, of course, because of the pandemic, we've had to change very dramatically. And I should say, you know, it's perhaps a criticism of universities that we were able to do it as quickly as we were, because, you know, why hadn't we been doing it beforehand, but changing in the way that we educated our students so that we could deliver our material electronically to them. And there's been a narrative now which has got into the press, which is that, you know, online delivery somehow isn't as rich an educational experience as face-to-face. But of course, you and I are having a very interactive conversation at the present time. Yeah. And I think the technology has caught up, which should allow us, the educators, to actually deliver every bit as rich an experience to students, provided they also get the other experiences that come with a university. I mean, what are your thoughts about the way we teach and how that's going to evolve, and is it ever going to go back to what it was before COVID?
I still think that for young people, the leaving home bit and the mixing with other people on a campus is an important part of the experience. It's not absolutely essential, but I think it is valuable for many young people, and I hope That's going to be possible again in the autumn, if not soon afterwards. But nevertheless, what's blended learning, as it's called, some combination of traditional physical learning and also learning online can be very valuable. Just like so many other areas when they go digital, first what tends to happen is people take the old format and just do it digitally. And that's kind of the lecture on Zoom, which may not be the world's most exciting experience. But pretty soon what happens is people realize that if you're digital, you can actually change the way that you teach. You can innovate in pedagogy. You can use all the techniques from computer games to hold people's attention. You can measure their progress actually much more thoroughly and carefully if you can see how they're progressing online, almost literally by the answers they're keyboarding in. So I think digital has the potential to be, if anything, better pedagogy than classic 300 young people sitting in a big lecture theatre. So I have hopes that it'll raise educational standards, even if at the moment it's been particularly just in the form of sticking the old programs into a digital format.
Yeah, I have heard it said, of course, that a lecture theatre is an extremely good way of transmitting coronavirus, but not a terribly good way of educating. Perhaps true. Now, David, you've spoken about the immediate response that we might make for people who are going into the workplace this year, next year. What about longer term? Because of course this pinch, which has possibly become a crush as a consequence of COVID, but this is going to really affect a generation. And how might society evolve to try and ensure that contract which you describe in your book is that we, our generation, live up to that contract in a sensible and appropriate way?
Yeah, well, I think that's the big challenge. And the fact is, first of all, before we go back to education, look at the two main forms that wealth property takes, and that is owning your own home and having a decent funded pension. And what I show in the book is that both of those assets, boomers have done very well. Boomers are very likely to be owner occupiers, and they're very likely also to have a generous pension, quite possibly a company pension. For the younger generation, both of those assets are much harder to come by. And so for housing, we've got to make it easier to build houses and flats. We've also got to make it easier to help young people with the deposit they need to get started on the housing ladder. And then similarly for pensions, where the good news is this auto-enrollment in the NEST schemes has included a lot of young people, but the bad news is they're not actually getting much money in those pots. So when I chaired an intergenerational commission at the Resolution Foundation, we proposed that when someone becomes about 30, why don't we just give them a capital grant of £10,000 on condition they use it for deposit for a flat or house. You could put it into your pension scheme if you wanted for it to be worth more. You could use it for education and training, perhaps use it to help set up a business. So they do need help, because if you don't have that kind of basic asset, it's going to be much harder to make progress through life. I think that's what we've got to do. And we've also got to carry on with an educational offer of adult learning, accessible adult learning through life, especially for young people who may have had their education opportunity first time round disrupted by the virus.
Yeah. Now, if you'll allow me just to press you a little, because a capital grant of 10 grand to everybody sounds like quite an expensive policy for a government, particularly a government that's presumably going to have had to respond to a recessional period just now. I mean, how do we find the money to do that? Where does it come from?
Well, we were very careful on it. First of all, when you say a lot of money, it is, if you do the very rough arithmetic, take a cohort of about 700,000 people a year. So you're talking about £7 billion. Yep. Now, £7 billion is a lot of money to you or me, but the government's total public expenditure is much more than £700 billion. In fact, it's heading towards £1 trillion. And the annual spending on benefits for pensioners is well over £100 billion. whereas meanwhile family benefits and credits have been cut back. So compared with a benefits budget approaching for all groups combined approaching 200 billion, it's actually not quite as much as it may sound. But even so, everything does have to be paid for. And I think the issue, sadly, I don't like higher taxes, but the issue of putting up taxes is going to be on the agenda. Not straight away, it's right to borrow the money to help us through the crisis, but looking out into the future, we'll have to go up. And to be honest, it is property and wealth that is undertaxed in Britain relative to earnings. So before we tax earnings more, I'd be looking if there weren't ways in which we could do things like reform council tax, so it collected more, especially from high value properties, things like that.
And of course, these, I mean, I think it's a smashing idea, and we are about festival of ideas, so it's a good starting point. But let me ask, I mean, there is always, these things always come with unintended consequences. And, you know, I just see the property magnates rubbing their hands and saying, we'll just hike up the price of our houses by 10 grand each because all these kids can now afford it. I mean, how do we stop that happening if we were to embrace the idea that you've proposed?
Yeah, I mean, that is a secondary effect. However, as these young people are still a relatively small part of the total housing market, I doubt if there would be a one-to-one feed through into prices, because there'll be many other buyers as well. And look, I mean, the other criticism I had when we brought it out was people on the media would say, but £10,000, you don't get much for £10,000. Why bother with that? So first of all, they'd say it was too expensive. Then they'd say it wasn't worth much. But actually, the shocking thing is, for people in their 20s, £10,000 more than doubles the wealth of 2/3 of young people. Most of them have nothing or a tiny amount. And we are in one of the biggest single changes in Britain in the last 20 or 30 years is that the value of property, assets, houses and pensions has increased relative to people's earnings and wages. And therefore, we're in a society where at the moment, inheritance has become more important. I never thought this would be my experience during my adult life, but actually inheriting money, having parents who own a house, is the best way of yourself getting a house. I don't think that's the kind of society people want to live in. You should have the opportunity, through your own efforts, through your own earnings, to secure a decent house or a decent pension. And this modest grant would help people with that.
Fantastic. Yeah. Now, David, I'm conscious we're coming to the end of our time, but I wonder, you are a man full of ideas. And you've obviously, I mean, it's now 10 years, it's almost 10 years since you wrote The Pinch, I think. What ideas are you working on now? What are your new thoughts and new inspiration?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, of course, I'm very interested, as so many people are now, in the green economy, in climate change. I wasn't really able to cover that in the book, partly because it's a massive subject in its own right. Though in the second edition of The Pinch, just out in the last few months, I have actually got the figures on that, which show that the boomer generation, the amount of carbon dioxide each one of us will have been responsible for during our lives, compared with the amount of carbon dioxide that a young person will be able to generate during their life in order to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees. If you do that calculation, younger people have to emit something between 1/4 and 1/6 of the carbon dioxide that we baby boomers have produced. So there's a massive climate and generational angle to climate. And look, I'm very interested in how we get a hydrogen infrastructure, in how one useful, incredibly valuable activity for these young people who might be unemployed is training them up so that they can retrofit and insulate the existing housing stock. Because most of houses are around for a long time. If we get down to zero carbon, our houses have to become more energy efficient. And of course, some of the other green investments that we need in offshore wind, tidal power, they're outside the southeast. So if you care about levelling up, investing in green energy, Hull, as you know, is the centre for experience probably on offshore wind. Investing in green energy as jobs for young people, investment outside London and the southeast tackling an intergenerational unfairness as well, something I got very interested in.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I had a very great pleasure of interviewing Gus O'Donnell in a similar sort of vein as this, and his idea, which actually resonates quite well with yours in the sense of giving these young people who are not getting jobs an occupation. And his idea is to get them all to insulate all the houses in Britain.
Yeah,
exactly your idea, which is, it's not a bad idea because it would kill two birds with one stone, of course.
Yeah.
David, as always, it has been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your contribution to the Festival of Ideas. And I actually thank you more broadly for your contribution just to education. It's been a pleasure knowing you and watching what you've done for education over a very long period of time. It's lovely seeing you again.
Thank you very much, Quintin. That's very kind of you. Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.